step beyond the marble columns and triumphant arches into the shadows of the Roman Empire. We often imagine Rome as a beacon of civilization, a place of philosophy, law, and monumental architecture. But beneath this veneer of glory lay a world of breathtaking brutality, a daily reality so harsh it's almost unimaginable to us today. This wasn't just a world of emperors and senators, it was a world of pain, fear, and a constant grinding struggle for survival. Forget the romanticized epics. Tonight, we journey into the dark heart of Rome to witness the true cost of its greatness. This is the story of the empire's forgotten souls, the millions who lived and died under the eagle's unforgiving gaze. The very foundation of Roman society was built on a brutal institution, slavery. It wasn't a footnote in their history, it was the engine that powered their entire world. At its peak, it's estimated that nearly a third of the population were enslaved. These were not just laborers, they were property, human tools with no rights, no freedom, and no hope. Captured in war, born into bondage, or sold to settle a debt, a slave's life was entirely at the mercy of their master. Beatings were common, a casual tool for discipline. The sounds of whips and cries of pain would have been a daily backdrop in wealthy households and on vast agricultural estates. For many, the work itself was a death sentence. Sent to the mines, they would toil in suffocating darkness, chipping away at rock until their bodies gave out, never to see the sun again. They built the roads, tilled the fields, and served the meals, yet they remained invisible, their humanity erased. And what happened if a slave dared to defy this system? The Roman response was swift and merciless. Rebellion was the ultimate crime, and its punishment was designed to be the ultimate deterrent. The story of Spartacus is famous, but his fate was shared by thousands. After his revolt was crushed, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading to Rome. For miles, the skyline was dotted with crosses, a gruesome warning to anyone who even dreamed of freedom. This wasn't an isolated incident. If a slave murdered their master, Roman law dictated that every single slave in the household, men, women, and children, be put to death. It was a clear and terrifying message. The life of one Roman citizen was worth more than hundreds of slaves. Their existence was a paradox, essential to the empire's function, yet utterly disposable. The long arm of Roman law was not just for slaves, it reached every corner of society, and its punishments were a public spectacle of power and terror. Justice was not blind, it was fiercely hierarchical. The wealthy, the honestiores, might face exile or a fine, but for the lower classes, the humiliores, the punishments were visceral and horrifying. The arena, which we associate with gladiatorial games, was also a stage for public executions. Condemned criminals, known as noxi, were thrown to wild beasts, lions, bears, leopards, in a gruesome display called damnatio ad bestias. The crowds would roar as human beings were torn apart, a blood-soaked form of entertainment. Other methods were just as cruel. Arsonists were burned alive, a punishment mirroring their crime. Patricide, the killing of one's own father, was met with a particularly bizarre and terrifying fate known as puina culae. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and then thrown into the sea or a river. The symbolism was clear. A person who committed such an unnatural act was cast out from the human world, to die amongst beasts. Even for Roman citizens, life was fraught with danger and hardship, especially in the sprawling, chaotic metropolis of Rome itself. While the elite lived in lavish villas with running water and heated floors, the vast majority of the city's 1 million inhabitants were crammed into flimsy, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae. These were fire traps built cheaply with wood and mud brick. Collapses were common, burying families alive. Fires were an ever-present threat, sweeping through the dense neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Sanitation was abysmal. Waste was simply thrown from windows onto the streets below, creating a foul-smelling and disease-ridden environment. Rivers of filth flowed through the alleys. The Tiber River, the city's main water source, was also its main sewer. Diseases like typhoid and cholera were rampant, and life expectancy was shockingly low. For the average Roman, reaching the age of 30 was a significant achievement. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in a person's life. With no understanding of germs and limited medical knowledge, both mother and infant mortality rates were incredibly high. If a child survived birth, their struggle was far from over. Unwanted infants, especially girls or those with deformities, were often abandoned, left to die of exposure on the city's rubbish heaps or at the base of a column. This practice, known as exposure, was legal and socially accepted. Some of these abandoned infants might be picked up by slave traders, their lives destined for bondage from the very beginning. For those who grew up in poverty, childhood was short. They were expected to work from a young age, contributing to the family's meager income. Education was a luxury reserved for the rich. For most, life was a relentless cycle of labor, hunger, and uncertainty. And then there was the violence that permeated every level of society. The streets of Rome were dangerous, especially at night. With no official police force, muggings and assaults were common. The wealthy hired private bodyguards, but the poor were left to fend for themselves. This culture of violence was most famously celebrated in the amphitheater. The gladiatorial games were the pinnacle of Roman entertainment, but these were not choreographed movie fights. They were brutal, life-or-death struggles. Gladiators were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, trained in specialized schools to kill for the amusement of the masses. The sand of the arena floor was constantly soaked with blood. While some gladiators could achieve fame and even win their freedom, the vast majority died violent, agonizing deaths. The roar of the crowd, the smell of blood, the final desperate moments of a defeated fighter. This was the reality of Rome's most beloved pastime. It was a society desensitized to death, where the suffering of others was a form of public celebration. The Roman military, the symbol of its power and discipline, was also an institution of extreme hardship. The life of a legionary was one of relentless toil and brutal discipline. For 20 years of service, soldiers marched thousands of miles in hobnailed sandals, carrying over 60 pounds of gear. They built roads, bridges, and forts under the blazing sun and in freezing winters. Food was monotonous, and pay was often delayed. Discipline was iron-fisted. Minor infractions could be punished with flogging. For cowardice or mutiny, the punishment was decimation. In this horrifying practice, a cohort would be divided into groups of 10, and the soldiers would draw lots. The unlucky one would then be beaten to death by his own 9 comrades. It was a system designed to instill absolute obedience through terror, bonding the men not just through loyalty, but through shared acts of sanctioned brutality. While service offered the promise of a pension and citizenship, many never survived to claim it, falling in battle, to disease, or to the harshness of military life itself. When we look at the grand ruins of the Roman Empire, it's easy to be captivated by its achievements. The aqueducts, the Colosseum, the legal codes that still influence us today, these are all testaments to an extraordinary civilization. But we must remember that this grandeur was built on a foundation of immense human suffering. The glory of the few was paid for by the agony of the many. The story of Rome is not just a tale of emperors and conquerors. It is the silent story of the slave in the mine, the family in the crumbling insula, the gladiator on the bloody sand, and the soldier dying far from home. By acknowledging this dark reality, we don't diminish Rome's legacy, but rather we gain a more complete and honest understanding of it. We see that even the greatest empires can have the darkest of hearts. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of Rome. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the past.